Morning. This video is going to demonstrate to you how to set up MFA for your users and also how to create an exclusion group for your non-MFA users. So we've logged into two screens that you'll see that are already open. So this main screen here is access via portal.office.com, and the other screen that you'll also need to have open is your Azure portal. So go through portal.azure.com. So I'm going to go through some very sort of basics for you. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a couple of user accounts. One of those will have MFA applied and one of them will not have MFA applied. So you click into the admin center and you'll see down users on the left hand side, and we look at our active users. You'll see for the purposes of the demo I've already set up a no MFA account, but what I'll do is very quickly run through how to set up a basic user just so you can follow the process. So we'll click into add a user. We'll call this one Bruce, and that will be MFA. So Bruce will have MFA applied to his account. His display name comes in as Bruce MFA, and we'll create his username as bruce.mfa. We'll create the password ourselves for the purposes of the demo. That way we can do a demo of what happens to Bruce as an MFA user and also Peter as a non-MFA user. Follow the defaults. You'll notice that we'll apply a license to that user. We're applying the EMS E5, which we have on our test tenant. You will need the EMS licensing SKU as part of your subscription to do MFA, so that's something that you do need to configure. If we follow through the defaults, there'll be no admin access onto that. We go next, and then we'll finish adding that account. Okay, so once you close it out, you'll see now that we have two users. So we have Bruce MFA, he will have MFA applied to him, and Peter, no MFA, who will not have MFA applied to his account. Now you'll see that we've got our user set up. We'll go in and create our group. This will be an exclusion group for administrators and privileged accounts or any specific users that you don't want MFA applied to for any reason. So on the left hand side in the same portal, if you click on groups, and we will add a group. Naming conventions are really important to make sure that you keep the name very sort of easy to use. Always create the group as a security group, and if you click next, and for the purposes of the demo we have created a 365 security MFA bypass group, which is what we'll call it, and we'll just put in a short description, MFA bypass. If we click next, you'll see the group type is security and the basic name 365 security MFA bypass with a description of MFA bypass. So we'll close that now. We'll do a refresh and that should come up in a second. You'll see now that's now appeared as your 365 MFA security bypass group. If we highlight the group and click that group, look under membership, and what we want to do is view all and manage members. So we'll be adding one of the users into that bypass group. Okay, so if we click to add members, and we'll add in we'll add in Peter, no MFA to that group. We'll save that. And group membership's updated and will take effect immediately. So the user now is Peter, no MFA, is a member of that security bypass group. So now we've set up our security group, we've added our user into that security group who will not have MFA applied to them. We'll look at MFA and some of the configurations we can do around the MFA policies. So we'll come out of this screen and we'll go into our Azure portal and click through to Active Directory. Halfway down on the left hand side, if you click security, you'll see that there's lots of links to documentation that's well worth having a little look through, and some security guidance, again, that's well worth having a look through. But on the left hand side, if you click MFA, you'll start to see some options around the actual MFA itself. So we'll configure additional cloud-based MFA settings. This will open a separate screen. A lot of these you would generally leave as the defaults around the application passwords. Trusted IPs, you may have some specific IP addresses where you don't need multi-factor authentication, so if that's relevant to yourselves, then obviously include those in there. One of the things that is a requirement for MAM or application protection, which is covered in one of our other videos, will be to have the Authenticator app applied to the device. You may want to turn on or off the option to do a text message to the phone. That's an additional step of authentication. For the purposes of this, we'll remove the text message to phone, we'll save those options, and that way you'll force a user to have the Authenticator app installed on their devices. It's worthwhile doing, and it will save some time later on. So we'll save that setting. What we're going to look to do now is we're going to look to apply our MFA settings via our conditional access policy. So on the left hand side, if you click conditional access, it is worth actually, if you do have some time, have a look through some of the links around the documentation and the guidance. There's some really useful links to the Microsoft website, so do take some time. We're going to set up a very basic policy today just to make sure that conditional access is applied across all of those cloud apps. You are able to be a little bit more granular on the detail if you need to be, but for the purposes of the demo, we'll just set it up as a basic policy. So we'll configure a new policy. Naming convention is important. What I've actually done is I've actually set this one as all apps require MFA except 365 security MFA bypass group. So we'll look to apply that group. And we'll look to apply that to all users, but we'll put in the exclusion. The exclusion will cover two things. So first of all, we'll configure directory roles. Always good just to make sure that you don't have the global administrator. So we'll click global administrator. That's your kind of break glass account. And to groups, we'll select a group. And if you remember, we set up our 365 security MFA bypass group. Please do make sure that you've set up that group correctly, and please do make sure that is applied as an exclusion group to that. What we'll do later on is demonstrate to you how the policy will apply to the user who's inside that group, and the policy will not apply to the user who is outside of that group. Okay, so click done. No cloud, so we click cloud apps or actions. We would select generally all cloud applications, although you can be quite selected if you want to. So if you want to be very specific around the apps that you want the policy to apply to, just going to select apps, click select, and that will come up on the right hand side. But for the purposes of the demo, we're going to do all cloud apps. Again, if you wanted to do all cloud apps but have a specific exclusion on a particular application, that's possible. Again, there as an example for you, Microsoft Teams. So let's say you wanted to exclude Teams, you would just add that in as an excluded application. But again, for the purposes of the demo, we'll just leave that it's included and it's all cloud applications. Our next is conditions. We will talk again in some other videos around things like sign-in risk. That's not configured. We're going to look at the options again around device platforms. You can be quite specific about a particular device that you want included or excluded. So if you, for example, wanted to configure that, you could set that to specific device platforms, be it Android, iOS, Windows or Mac OS, and again you have the opportunity to exclude any specific there, but again for the purposes of the demo we'll leave it configured across all platforms. Okay, the locations, So we won't configure the locations, but you could be quite specific again if you wanted to, and you could configure either yes to kind of any location, or if you had any trusted locations that you'd configured elsewhere, again that could be configured, or you could just configure selected locations. But again, for the purposes of this, we'll just leave it as the defaults. Client apps, again, we'll leave as the defaults, but you can again be quite specific that if it was a browser or just mobile apps and desktop clients, you can then go in and configure some more granular level in that detail. But again, we'll just leave this as the defaults. And again, on the device states, so if you had a device that was either hybrid, AD joined or Azure registered, then you could include devices in a particular device state. But again, for the purposes of the video, we'll just leave everything as the defaults. We then go into the access controls, and you can see on the right hand side you've got options is grant access or block access. So for the purposes of this, the grant access and requires multi-factor authentication. So simply tick that box. All of the cloud apps that anyone gets to from any device in any location, with the exceptions of the user in the bypass group, will require MFA to access your corporate data. Sessions is something which is a lot more advanced. If you are an E5 license holder and you have MCAS capability, you can set up session controls, but again, for the purposes of this, we'll just leave that set as the defaults. You then have three options at the bottom, which is enable the policy into report only, on or off. Now, obviously, report only, we'll leave that on for the time being, because what we'll look to do is to demonstrate the differences between the two users that we created and how the policy will be applying to one of those users, but the policy will not apply to the other one of those users. Once you come away from report only and you turn the policy to on, it will then apply to all users except users who are in that security bypass group. So for the purposes of now, we'll just leave report only enabled, and then we'll create that policy. You'll see now that CA01 has been set up and configured. It's in report only mode, and we'll start to look at what we call what if. So if we look at our what if, this will start to show you what would happen to all of those specific users. So if we go into our users, and if we look at bruce.mfa and we add bruce.mfa and we select Bruce, what if? So you'll see now that Bruce will be applied that policy, CA01. It will require multi-factor authentication, but at the moment it is in a state of report only. So we know that Bruce.mfa is going to get that policy applied. If we then click back in and we go to Peter.noMFA, who's in our exclusion group, and we select Peter and we do a what if, you'll see quite clearly there are no policies applied to Peter. So that's demonstrable evidence of the fact that the policy is applying to Bruce. So we know Bruce is going to get MFA'd. We also now know that Peter will not get MFA'd. So that's really demonstrating the importance of making sure that we do have that security access group.